chapter 5. But let's continue and we'll get right back to it. As you said, Margaret, at the bottom of page 146 right here. Obviously the person. Does anyone want to read? Anyone?
I'll read, Rabbi.
Oh, thank you, Jordan. Thank you.
Thanks. Obviously, the person who comprehends a halachic ruling does not assimilate the whole of the divine wisdom relating to this matter. Even when he understands the entire array of legal principles and processes that relate to this law and how all this derives from the Torah, he comprehends the subject on only one plane. He does not understand the many strata of meaning that lie beyond the grasp of human reason or even the full significance of the law. But in understanding a particular aspect of it at a particular level, he grasps a point of truth, assimilating, if only a particle, of the divine truth.
Right. Continue a little bit because here's a good example. Especially if you're a mathematician, you'll connect to this.
By way of example, the equations a plus b equals c and 1 equal 2 say in effect the same thing. The first is general and abstract, and the second is specific. The first sets up a principle, and the second gives a particular example of this principle. When teaching a small child, one teaches the specific case, because the child can learn and understand that thoroughly, but he cannot comprehend the general principle. Yet, despite the fact that the abstract equation is beyond the child's comprehension, when he comprehends that an apple and another apple make 2 apples, he has grasped something of the truth of the formula. By the same token, when a person studies a halacha about an ox and a donkey, he is assimilating not a mere expression or analog of the divine wisdom, but something of its very essence. When a person listens to a profound lecture and understands only the introductory joke, he has grasped nothing of the wisdom. He has grasped the analogy, but not what it relates to, the garment without its content. But one who understands 2 plus 2 equal 4 understands something of the concept itself, although not its entirety, its full depth and breadth. Indeed, this is the only way in which man can grasp something of that divine truth.
Right. So, I mean, the example, of course, is brilliant here by Rabbi Steinsaltz, but it reflects this big idea that the finite being will never fully be able to understand the infinite being, God himself. We might be able to understand some of the formulas, like 2 plus 2 equals 4, or sorry, 1 plus, yeah, he uses both equations, 1 plus 1 equals 2, and 2 plus 2 equals 4. But the general principle of the idea from which this stems, that we may never be able to grasp. And I think that's 2 ways really of approaching God, and particularly the study of Torah, since that's the main topic here. You know, you can study the Talmud, and as he mentioned, you can study about an ox and a donkey. And you can very well understand what an ox is, what a donkey is, and whatever the discussion is about the ox and the donkey. But of course, the Talmud here is reflecting something much deeper. Yes, it is speaking about an ox and a donkey. And when it speaks about an ox that bites and therefore needs to be, separated from human beings and undomesticated, then it actually has an application to life. But the Talmud, by speaking about the ox, does not just want us to relate to the application to life, even though that too is important, but it wants us to try and get a glimpse into the general principle of God, which sometimes is doable, sometimes is not. Depends, I think, both on the maturity of a person's spiritual mind, not just intellectual mind, but also it depends on how much God allows us in. Sometimes there are things that are simply infinite, and the finite being, again, cannot grasp. I think we saw this principle in yesterday's portion, in the tragic event in which we read about the 2 sons of Aaron dying in the middle of the celebration of the inauguration of the tabernacle. And Aaron responds with silence. Vayidom Aaron. We spoke about this a little bit in Shul yesterday. Aaron was silent. And in that silence, there is this idea that Rabbi Steinsaltz is speaking about, that there are things I just can't understand. there's a general principle that's beyond me. So to try and explain it, some people try to explain tragedies or it happened because of this with words. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. At the end of the day, the finite being is finite, and it won't be able to always understand this general principle that Rabbi Steinsaltz is speaking about. But that's the way we ought to approach the study of the Torah. I think that's why it is so important, and the Talmud speaks about this in very dramatic terms, that before we study the Torah, we should say the blessing of the studying of the Torah, to the point that the Talmud even makes a statement that the destruction of the temple happened because people would not say the blessing of the Torah, Abocher Batorah, that we say, by the way, that's the same blessing as the Aliyah. When you get an Aliyah to the Torah, that's the blessing that you say that. But the Talmud makes this bold statement that the temple was destroyed because people would not say the blessing of the study of the Torah before studying Torah. Why is it such a big deal? So you don't say the blessing. Do we all say the blessing? By the way, it's part of the morning blessings that we say, and that therefore allows us to study Torah throughout the day because we said this blessing. But why is it so important to say the blessing of the study of the Torah before studying the Torah? Because this blessing, what it basically does is that it gives us the awareness that the study of the Torah is not like the study of any other book, not a history book and not a mathematical book, but it's the study of God himself. And if we don't approach the study of the Torah with that awareness, then we'll be doing an injustice to God himself. How so? By thinking that God is 2 + 2 = 4. And forgetting that there's a much bigger picture to the 2 + 2 = 4. And therefore, you can't study Torah like that. You can't study Torah and really connect your mind with a divine mind if you don't know that this is a divine mind. And it almost misses the point entirely. It's almost like, speaking to a dignitary without knowing that he's a dignitary. You miss the point. I mean, so it's a good conversation maybe you had, but there's a general picture. And by the way, dare I say, it's almost like talking to anybody, forget dignitaries, anybody before knowing who they are. Rabbi Steinsaltz would often say, you can't relate to the question, you have to relate to the question behind the question. You have to relate to the person behind the question. When you speak to someone, you have to understand the context. If you miss the context, then you miss the point. You can have ideas conveyed by people, but if you don't understand who these people were, then the ideas are naught, or amount to naught. I think that's why Rabbi Steinsaltz was so obsessed and demanded that in his every commentary of the Talmud, of the Torah, of the Mishnah, of Maimonides, Ethics of Our Fathers, of every important book in the Jewish canon, he wanted the biographies of the people mentioned on the sidelines. He wanted the encyclopedic knowledge of the plants mentioned on the sidelines. He wanted every piece of knowledge that one can find about the topics mentioned on the page, because he understood that so beautifully. And that is that there's a context to every idea. And if we cannot understand the context, then the idea really can't be understood. And it's certainly true for God himself. I like the note here, but that the blessing as Over L'Asiyah interpreted as transforms us into being part of doing, not just passive participants. That's right. Part of the blessing of studying the Torah and almost forces us or forces us to engage, to become active participant, and not just to study in order to study, but really to translate the study into action, which again, I think is part of understanding the context, the general principles. Rabbi Steinsaltz puts it here, that God wants us to connect with him mind to mind, but he also wants that to have an effect. I saw there was a video circulated after Passover about this. I think it was a Gerer Chassid, a Hasidic Jew of the Gerer lineage, and he came the day after the last day of Passover, the day after Achron Shel Pesach. He came to receive $1 from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And the Rebbe said, no, the man told the Rebbe, I was by my Rebbe, the Gerer Rebbe, for the last day of Passover. It was a very emotional day. The Rebbe cried. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe told this man, And what did the Rebbe speak about? What was the nekuda? What was the action part of the speech? And the man said, it was just a very emotional speech. And he went like this with his hands. And the Rebbe said, you're doing this, but there's no practical side to it. What's the lemaise? What's the action? So it's nice. So you flew into an ecstasy. But if there's no action, and like this blessing over the study of the Torah almost demands from us, then maybe we miss the point. And I think that's part again of understanding the general principle. When we come to study Torah, we are studying from an entity, from God himself, who wants us then to translate the study into action. So again, we can study Torah all we want, and that's fine, and it's a mitzvah in and of itself, like we mentioned. But the point here that the Tanya is making is that if we are studying just about the ox and just about the donkey, good, fine. So now you know that an ox that bites 3 times ought to be excommunicated. Great. But you missed the point in many ways, because it's talking about something much, much deeper. And it's that you have to connect to. And it's the person telling you about the ox that you also, or the entity, God himself, that's telling you about the ox that you have to connect to. I think it's true versus God, and dare I add here, that I think it's true versus human beings. We cannot really converse with human beings if we don't understand where they came from. There's a great story that Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach tells, the singing rabbi, of how in the 50s, he walked into a synagogue. I think it was in Poland. He gave concerts all around the world. And it was Shabbat morning, and he walks into a synagogue, and he's expecting to have a spiritually uplifting experience. Yet the cantor, the chazan, is swallowing the words, and his voice is shaky, and he just can't connect. So he decides to go outside and pray so that at least he can meditate on his own. During the Torah reading, he has to come back. And he sees that the person who was the cantor is the one carrying the Torah, and he's the one passing it through the shul for everyone to kiss the Torah. And he notices that the man is blind. So now he's even more upset. How can a guy like that be asked to lead the congregation? So he finds out that this man was actually the cantor in the main synagogue in Lublin, Poland, before the war. And he was unfortunately beaten and tortured so badly by the Nazis that he lost his eyesight and he forgot most of the prayers. But in order to revive him, the congregation kept asking him, be the cantor, knowing that music will awaken him and again, resuscitate it. But he kept on refusing. That Shabbat was the first time he said yes. And Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach tells himself, well, how dare I judge a person like that, who was such a holy man. And I'm dismissing him, saying he doesn't even know how to pray, and that it's bothering my own prayer. So, and very often we judge the conclusions when we encounter people, whether directly or indirectly, like this chazan, because we miss the context, we miss the general principle. All we see is the 2 + 2 = 4. So what? So you understood the 2 + 2 = 4, but you don't understand anything really. And that's true for God himself. So God tells us things in the Torah, but let's connect to the God that's telling us those words, not just to the words themselves. And that's really the main idea here. Again, I don't want to have a monologue, so please share your comments, questions, disagreements, whatever it may be.
Well, if I didn't make a comment,
Please,
then
Ron.
I wouldn't be here. So just a bunch of short little things. First, when the Talmud talked about because they lost the temple because people didn't say the blessing, I think it's more like today people don't go to the temple, and we see whether it's a Jewish temple or churches, people aren't connecting with God. Saying the blessing before, for me, is like the orchestra tuning up right before they're going to start playing. Everybody gets on the same vibration and they're all tuning in together, and then they can move into the music. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, but let me mention one important thing, and that is, I agree with you that the temple certainly gives that push, but we shouldn't create a dependence over the temple. And you're hearing this from a rabbi of a congregation. that
Absolutely.
to come to the temple.
No,
I remember,
absolutely.
quote Rabbi Steinsaltz, I remember very vividly that he was speaking at a synagogue in New Jersey, and I won't say what affiliation, but he was speaking at a synagogue. I won't say the synagogue either. All I say is that it was in New Jersey. And he said to them, Rabbi Steinsaltz could be very forthright, and he, in a way, many times sought to give that shock treatment to people. So put that in that context. We have to understand here the general principle. But he told them, please, I beg you one thing. Don't treat God like many people treat their old man here in America. Because people, when they have their father that is becoming old, what do? They put him in a house, and they visit him from time to time. And Rabbi Steinsaltz would say, that's not how you ought to treat God. You put him in the temple, and you visit him from time to time. But outside of the temple, you can do whatever you want. That's not what Judaism is about. You have to bring God home. So as much as the temple is important, we have to bring God home and make him a part of our individual lives too. Just to relate to that comment. But thank you, Ronnie. Go ahead. Yeah, continue.
Now you made me forget.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Yes, Rabbi Eisen.
I just want to comment
yes.
for a second on Ronnie's comment, because I think it could be expanded beyond what some of us used to call the edifice complex, that it's not temple per se, as much as a religious context, what we're doing Jewishly. Not everyone is going to be Haredi, not everyone's going to be humanistic, but to have some kind of a God context, you might say, to what we're doing. Because statistics are pretty honest about this and forthright. The people who are, quote, just Jewish are terminal, in the sense that there is nothing left of them or to their lineage later on. But people who remain engaged from some kind of spiritual context, saying a blessing before does that, have a, quote, future as Jews. They're continually growing, striving, etc. And that does sometimes get passed on. I mean, there's so many variables, there's no sure formula. But I think that what Ronnie said is really hitting on what the statistics are showing as well.
Right. No, very well said. I think it's that idea of taking ownership over your own Judaism, doing something about it. Because if it's just something that's your identity, but something that you don't really engage in, then it gets lost. Like anything else. There's a great documentary, and I don't know why I'm mentioning this, because it's very, very unholy, but it's still a good documentary called The Search for Greatness. I don't know if you saw it. I saw it on a Delta flight a few years ago. The Search for Greatness focuses on, I think, 4 or 5 stars in the world of sports. So Pelé is the soccer player that's been focused on. Michael Jordan is another one. Gretzky from the ice hockey world is focused. And they made they drew a common denominator between all of these stars, and that is that they, number one, grew in milieus that were obsessed about their sport, and that contributed to their own obsession towards the sport, and therefore to their own excellence in the sport. And at the same time, they gave of themselves completely. They sacrificed their lives for the sport. They wouldn't have a social life. They wouldn't have other types of life. And I'm thinking about that because I want to make a parallel to Jewish life. If we're speaking about survival and thriving, not just survival, then I think we need the same thing. We need that milieu that we're in. Therefore, community is so important. And at the same time, we also need to sacrifice our own little things sometimes and ensure that it becomes a part of us, that sport of Judaism, in a way, becomes a part of us and a part of our actions, a part of our daily.
What does that mean, sacrifice part of us? Can you talk about that?
Well, listen, yeah, of course. I mean, I think it's simple. On Shabbat morning, I won't go and play golf. I'll come to synagogue. Yes, I love the game of golf, but I'm going to sacrifice my love for the game of golf to come to synagogue. I mean, for some people, it's that. For other people, it's, you know what? I love shrimps. I'm not going to have it today because I love Judaism. And Judaism demands sacrifice on many levels, but these are simple things.
Thank God I don't play golf.
Rabbi, what's that joke about the guy who got a hole in one on Yom Kippur?
That's right.
You can't tell anybody.
You can't tell anybody. Yeah. The search for greatness. Yes, someone just asked me. Yeah, I'm going to put it. You can Google it. I don't know. Search for greatness. Sorry. Search for greatness is the name of the documentary. If you like sports, I love sports. If you like sports, if you love the human condition and studying about the human condition, then you'll like it. But again, it connects to Judaism and connects to our ability to not to survive, but to thrive as Jews.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
I think I remember what I forgot.
Oh, please, yes.
But maybe I don't, but I'm going to say this anyway. So when people are studying Torah and we talk about the donkey and the ox and what did it mean about biting and you separate, is it not reality or truth that each person, as they truly study Torah, I mean, study Torah, not listen to the study of Torah, that they may have their own interpretations, the meaning from their own personal life, what they've gone through, that brings out the meaning for them. And it acts as more of a mirror for them.
Yeah, I think that's beautifully said.
Connected.
That's right. Very. What did you say, Shmuel?
Connected.
Keneged. Right.
The mirror compensate.
Right. Very often we study the Torah from our own lenses, and therefore our eye a little bit, not the selfish eye, but our healthy eye is reflected in the study. Now, maybe that's why the Talmud says, Shivim panim la Torah, that there are 70 faces to the Torah. I would dare say that if there are 600,000 root souls, so there are 600,000 faces to the Torah. Much more than 70. 70 maybe reflects the number of nations, or it's based really on this idea that a Greek governor once asked 70 sages to translate the Torah. And they each translated it identically to one another. To prove the authenticity. God made that little miracle to prove the authenticity of the Torah and how accurate it is. But still, there are 70 sages or 70 faces to the Torah. But again, 600,000, I think, faces to the Torah. And as the Talmud itself says, when we find even different opinions, Talmud says, Elu va'elu divrei Elokim chaim. These and these are words of, living words of God. Elokim chaim, divrei Elokim chaim. They both reflect God's voices. But you're right. But the idea again is that we have to make it our own. We have to approach it from a very intimate and personal standpoint. It's not just something that's...
We have to own it ourselves.
Right, exactly. It has to really bother us, if I may connect this, but yesterday, I reread the words of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the late Lubavitcher Rebbe, blessed memory, who 30 years ago, exactly, and that's why we reread them yesterday, 30 years ago on the 28th of Nisan, shocked the world. And he shocked the world because in a very impromptu way, after evening services, it was a regular weekday, he asked to speak. There was no microphone and I had to scramble and get a microphone quickly. And he was already an elderly man. And he spoke for very little. And for 2 minutes and 45 seconds to be exact, or 165 seconds, that's what it is. He said to all of his followers that I've done everything to bring Mashiach. And I'm, in a way, was shouting that everything that we've done until now amounts to naught because Mashiach hasn't come. And I've done everything I can. Now I'm passing the task on to you. And people were saying, wow, this is the great Rebbe who always assumed more and more on his shoulders and fought for his people. And now it sounds like he was giving up. 6 months later, by the way, he had a stroke that eventually led to his passing. And people then understood what was happening. But it's very, very disturbing to read his words. Very, very disturbing. And I believe, my 2 cents on this, is that the Rebbe wanted people to care about the coming of the Mashiach and to care about bettering the world, which is what this is about, and elevating the world to a state that eventually it will raise the consciousness of the world and usher in the era of Mashiach. he wanted people to care about it as much as he cared about it. He was so passionate about it and so giving and so dedicated to this cause, and he really wanted people to be as dedicated. And he sees, what's funny is that if you see the video of this, then so he speaks for a little bit and he shakes, the whole podium shakes, and then people didn't know what to do. So immediately after the speech, the people who were there started shouting, Ad matai, until when we want Mashiach to come. And this elderly Hasidic Jew comes to the Rebbe, and you see it on video, and he was like shocked. He says to the Rebbe, what just happened? And the Rebbe tells him, Lo naga velo paga. It didn't touch anybody, what I said. There needs to be a fire ignited. It's enough. But I think it's true for Judaism in general, if this is the context of our conversation. That is that we need to care about it. It needs to really, really, really bother us to the point that it shakes us and it engages us.
So,
but just to relate to Judaism as something outside of us is not something that will thrive over generations. So
taking what the Rebbe said, it sounded like he was really, I don't know the right word, disappointed. I was going to say some other words. Disappointed in all his fellow Jews that they're depending on him to do something. And I find it shocking that they found it shocking. I found it. Why should that be so shocking? Why? It's such an easy thing. If they've learned anything from Torah, they should have known that.
Yeah, it reminds you of Moses a little bit, who also was there. But I think the word disappointment might be a layer of that emotion. I think the Rebbe was very demanding, very, very. He said it at the onset, the first speech he gave, that don't expect me to do the work for you.
Yeah,
I'll guide you, but you got to do your own work.
Isn't that what, doesn't Torah teach us that?
Right. Now, it's almost like, I don't even want to make the comparison, lahavdil elef avdalot, as we say, but going back to the world of sports, Michael Jordan was a very demanding teammate. He would shout at his teammates all the time. When you're Michael Jordan, so you can't expect, on the other hand, it's like, fine, I understand where he's coming from, but it's hard to be a Michael Jordan. And there's only one Michael Jordan on the team. You're expecting everyone to be Michael Jordan. It's very hard. I understand. So you have the gift. So in a way, I'm saying this to the Rebbe himself. I understand. It's demanding, but nonetheless, it's an important voice and it's important demand because it must engage us. It must really, really shake us.
And it goes back for me as beginning of our conversation to say the blessing before the study. And when you say the blessing, you need to say it and connect. And I just find it shocking that the story that I just heard, that other people were shocked at what the Rebbe, but keep on going.
Because it was very much unlike the Rebbe. If you follow the Rebbe's years, you'll see that the Rebbe was, first of all, a very loving human being and very always gave himself over to people, to everyone and anyone. And when he spoke about Mashiach, it was always in the context of, let's do it together. And here he's saying, no, it's left to you. That was the shocking part. I'll conclude with a story that might, relate to this. And it's a story about a Hasidic Jew. His name was Dr. Perlov, who sent a whole bunch of Hasidic stories to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And one of them, the Rebbe would repeat in his talks. I think he repeated it over the years 3 or 4 or 5 times. But the story about a teacher who was in a simple village, and he was the only teacher of the village. He would teach the people Torah. Now, the people of the village did not know Hebrew, so whenever there was a Hebrew text, he would translate it. One day, a letter written in Hebrew came to the village. So they went to the teacher, hey, there's a letter in Hebrew. And it's addressed to this and this person in the village. Can you read it to him and translate it? So he called this person in the village and he read the letter. And what was the letter about? The letter in Hebrew was about telling this man that his father just passed. So he reads this, and as soon as this man hears that his father passed, he faints. Now the Rebbe would ask the question, that it really doesn't make sense. The person who was supposed to faint was the teacher himself. He was receiving it firsthand. The person listening to him was receiving these news secondhand. So the person that's reading it, who's receiving firsthand, he's the one. If these news are so tragic, he was the one who's supposed to faint. And the Rebbe answered, no, no, no. The answer is simple. This man who passed was that person's father, and it touched him, therefore, to the core. The man reading it, someone else's father, it's not me.
Mhm.
And he says, we can't act like that when it comes to Judaism. This is our father. God is our father. It's our entity. It's our identity. That's it must touch us to the core. And if something, you know, if something is missing in our Jewish lives, then it should shake us so that we can grow. And like Rabbi Eisen, it doesn't mean that everyone should be Haredi or everyone should be humanist. Labels are labels, and they belong to the meatpacking industry. But we should be shaken to the point that we want to be engaged. We want to do something. You know, Rabbi Steinsaltz will very often quote, and I always saw him with tears when he would quote this story. I mean, we tell the story about a man, a kibbutznik that he once met, and he was far from Judaism, completely disengaged. And one day, many years later, he sees him, and the man is as engaged in Judaism as you can be. He says to him, what happened? And this man says, well, I was reading the Tanakh, the Bible, and I was reading that God, that it says that God desires the work of your hand. And when he came to that passage, he was so shaken. He says, if God desires me, how can I not desire him?
Mm.
And that shook him, and it changed his life. But it's true, God desires us, and we must be shaken. Now, can we be shaken 24 hours of the day? I don't know. But we can, it's a possibility to walk into.